Now, there's no doubt that there is rising disenchantment about democracy in Nigeria. But interestingly, public support for the principle of democracy appears to still be very high indeed, with many people saying that it's the best form of government there is. But in survey after survey, there appear to be a generational pattern of decline in support for democracy in Nigeria. And a lot of that narrative is driven by real problems that we see in this country, where undeniably there are real challenges to democracy. And amongst all groups, irrespective of age, class or creed, there is clearly a disenchantment with politics, particularly confidence in Nigeria's institutions, with terrible findings in the public's perception of whether the system is delivering for them, and huge declines in confidence in key institutions like political parties, the Electoral Commission, INEC, the National Assembly and the judiciary. So given this paradox, how sustainable is it for Nigerians to have an abstract notion of democracy while virtually every practical application of it seems to be disappointing? Well, for his assessment of Nigeria's democracy, I'm joined now in the studio by the development expert, Professor of Political Science and Chair of the Editorial Board of Nigeria's Premium Times newspaper, Professor Jibrin Ibrahim, who's also a noted psephologist and Senior Fellow at the Center for Democracy and Development. Prof, great to see you again.
Always a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very much indeed for coming in. Now, you've spoken and written a lot about the perils of Nigerian democracy. I just saw an article that you wrote recently. Clearly, there appears to be rising disenchantment in this country about democracy. What are we getting wrong about democracy in this country?
I think basically people in this country have been voting for democratic regimes 24, 25 years. And throughout this period, there are specific expectations of democracy. And those expectations are not being realized. So people are getting frustrated, people are getting upset, and people are beginning to look for why is it that we don't have the democracy we thought we voted for, that we expect, and that's in consonance with our constitution and laws. And the answer, I think, is very straightforward. Nigeria's Fourth Republic has been unable to reproduce leaders with a commitment to democracy and its ideals. And indeed, Nigeria's political class seems extremely competent in eroding the essentials of the democratic order. And it is that competence that is causing a lot of anger and concern among Nigerians, that those we put in power to realize our democratic ideals and expectations are precisely the ones failing us repeatedly.
And in that regard, given that very interesting analysis you just gave, what shape would you say Nigeria's democracy is in today?
I think a lot of people are posing serious questions about the nature of our democracy. I think the first concern people have is that money seems to have taken over the arena of Nigerian politics. So people with an extremely unhealthily large purse succeed in getting into positions of power, which they use to now accumulate more wealth. So people are now seeing the issue in terms of our elections is increasingly wealth, but not just wealth, stolen or looted public money that's used to frustrate the democratic aspirations. I think the second concern people have about the way in which our democracy is playing out is the way in which those who have accessed power use that position to abuse the rule of law, to negate human rights, to favor their own nests, as it were, so that power, which should be used for the benefit of the people, is used as an instrument to entrench the power obtained by people with money. I think the third and one of the most worrying concerns Nigerians have about democracy is the instrument for contesting for power, which is the political party. By definition, the political party is supposed to be composed of members who turn out to vote for parties of their choice. The principles the parties stand for, what they do, who they place on the electoral platforms during the elections, are all supposed to reflect party members. But Nigerians have come to understand that these political parties are not run by the ordinary party members. It's not their voice that's heard, and it's not their action that is seen. It's a number of what we call political party barons, or we call them godfathers. And Nigeria has even this incredible phrase of owners of the party that control the affairs of these parties, and their members do not really play the role they are expected to. Even the moment of power of the member, which is a party convention for nominations or to elect party leadership, is completely controlled by these barons and godfathers, that people realize this is not my party. I'm just an instrument used by those who own this political party. So these are the specifics, I think, of some of the concerns.
So, I mean, I'm wondering whether or not, in your assessment, the problem lies in our expectations of democracy, at least part of the problem. And in that regard, should we perhaps be looking back to the origins of democracy for ideas on what we should expect from democracy?
I think the fact of the matter is that it's not so much the expectations of Nigerians that's the problem. I think it's the original sin. In 1999, after a long struggle against military rule, those who organized and led that struggle for democracy had become very frustrated with the repeated ways in which the military frustrated multiple transitions to civil rule. And when eventually the election came in 1999, a lot of those people who have shown a demonstrated commitment to democracy were not in the contest. Professional politicians who've always known political power in our history can produce wealth and enjoyment for them were the ones at the forefront. And once they got in, they made sure the operating rules are structured to favor their reproduction. And what every Nigerian would tell you is that the person representing their constituency wouldn't be, in the local definition of a good leader, considered to be one. It would be somebody who has a crookish background, somebody who has done things that wouldn't be considered very honest or just or correct. They are the ones at the forefront.
But I take that on board. I mean, clearly, I think that's, a lot of people would say that that is spot on. But those people are also coming out of the pool of Nigerian society. Somebody gave an example once of somebody opening their window and throwing rubbish onto the streets while he was talking to someone and saying, this country is so filthy. And I'm wondering whether you think that it should be more about what we expect of democracy or more about what we owe democracy as citizens.
You see, the expectations for democracy is that public resources would be used for the public good. That is what the expectation for democracy is, historically, theoretically, any way you look at it. What people see is that public resources are used for the private greed of
but
those
isn't
in
it our
power.
responsibility to hold those people to account?
Absolutely.
I mean, we let them get away with it.
And that's where the
And that's
problem
part of
is.
democracy, isn't it? Democracy is to hold people to account. Democracy is government of the people, for the people, by the people. We are the people, it's our democracy, and we're letting people trample all over it.
I think we agreed there that the accountability deficit is the core problem of Nigerian democracy. That we have failed to use accountability mechanisms available in the Constitution and in our laws to make those in power accountable. For example, members of the houses of assembly or the House of Representatives or Senate can be removed by constituents. There is a mechanism spelled out in the Constitution, but in the last 25 years, we have failed to remove even one person who has been elected in spite of those provisions.
So do you see that as a paradox? And if so, do you wonder how sustainable it is for Nigerians to have this abstract notion of democracy as a good thing, while every practical application of it seems to be disappointing, both on the part of the people that have been elected and on the part of the people who do the electing?
I think what it tells us really is that when you have democracy, you can't sit back and expect you will enjoy that democracy if you don't struggle to sustain it, to make it real, to make its accountability mechanisms work. I think that's where we've had a real challenge in this country. We simply expect our democracy to deliver. And the fact of the matter is that it's in the nature of power that those who have acquired power don't want to give it up to the people, except if the people have ways of compelling them to do so. And is that thinking, that culture, that capacity to think through these accountability mechanisms and how you can force people in power to do the right thing or to pay a price if they refuse to, that has been lacking. And I think essentially what this tells us, we have to really go back to school in terms of how do we make our democracy work for the people.
That's a very good point. It is logical for us to like the principle of democracy, and yet we recognize, as you correctly pointed out, that for all sorts of reasons, it's not delivering for us. Can you, though, point to a country, I mean, you travel a lot, can you point to a country perhaps in Africa that is doing the right things with democracy that Nigeria is doing wrong?
I think we've just gone through the Senegalese election, and the Senegalese elections were extremely interesting because you had a president on seat that was determined to change the constitution to give himself a third term, and to do that was ready to use state power to crush his opponents, including jailing all those who he saw as competitors, using the judiciary to make them lose their liberty, preventing many from contesting, sending others yet on exile out of the country. And at the end of the day, that country was able to ensure that president, Macky Sall, was unable to get his third term, and the party, he said, will not be allowed into power in his lifetime is the party that's in power today. And they've done that not just once this year. You recall Abdou Diouf in 2000, when after he took over from Seda Senghor, who was the pioneer president, was also bundled out of office by popular sentiments, just as the person who took over from him, Abdoulaye Wade, in 2012, suffered the same fate. So they have shown, for example, this very high capacity to ensure, at least at the national level, democracy is able to deliver the president they want. We've shown less capacity. And part of the difference between Senegal and Nigeria is the way in which in Nigeria you have elections in which the majority of the electorate will say, well, those top 5 candidates wouldn't be my top 5 candidates. It's a very poor choice the parties are giving me, and I'm being forced to choose between people who are of very poor quality. And that's really the problem with Nigerian democracy, that the parties are able to produce the worst possible candidates in the estimation of the population. And that's what causes this frustration among people who don't see the choice before them being a very good one.
But given what you're telling us, why should we stick with democracy? I mean, I think it was the British philosopher Erica Benner who wrote the book Adventures in Democracy, which is an account of her passage through various democracies, but also takes the reader back to the origins of our understanding of democracy. And she says in the prologue to her book that it puts an unsparing spotlight that on the confusions, fears, idiocies, embarrassments, pretensions, double standards, and delusions that are part of every democracy. Given all that, I mean, some would say perhaps we should find another form of government. If it's got all those problems, why are we still defending democracy? I mean, we don't even have a guarantee that our votes will count.
Exactly, and I will agree with that sentiment, but there is a qualifier you have to put into the equation, which is that, well, what's the alternative? So democracy, as the saying goes, is a very bad form of government, except that all the others are worse than it. So it's a question of what are the choices before you. We've had single-party rule for a very long time in Africa, and it's been disastrous. We've had decades of military rule, and it's been disastrous. And each time we've had negation of democracy, we find ourselves in a situation in which we start longing for that democracy that we complain and vilify so much. So there is in democracy real gains, real advantages, real benefits for people.
Doesn't that depend on what we understand democracy to actually be? Because I'm wondering what the basic Nigerian definition of democracy is. If you look historically at the idea of democracy, I mean, the word seems to have an enormously broad reach. There have been democracies which incorporated slavery, for example, and very strong forms of government. So against that historical background, what's our essential definition of democracy in the Nigerian context?
You see, Democracy is always contextual. We have been very critical of our democracy because we haven't seen it grow in the last 25 years that it has been operational. And we had expected it to grow and improve precisely because the analysis done previously was because the First Republic and the Second Republic and the Third Republic were all truncated after a few years. We never gave democracy an opportunity to blossom. And now it has had 25 years and it has not been improving. However, think back. Think back, for example, 1984 January, when Buhari and Idi Agbon were in power. And when they had printed copies of Decree 2, that means anybody can be picked up from the streets and put in jail for treason against the state. And it was used liberally so that you don't even have the right to go through the process of the police establishing some suspicion of your committing something. Just the fact that you have this pre-signed copies of Decree 2 with all the security agents means everybody can just be picked up and sent to jail. All the politicians of the Second Republic that were thrown into jail, 100% of them were not crooks or thieves, as the military said. So that is what's called arbitrary rule at its worst. And the fact of the matter, in spite of all our criticism of current Nigerian democracy, it's not as bad as it
Although
was at that
sometimes
time.
it dangerously veers in that direction. But an obvious problem with democracy in a country like Nigeria is the system of power sharing, because that's essentially what it is, between groups of people and individuals who don't necessarily trust each other. You've got all that boiled into one package. I mean, and an obvious problem with that power sharing system is that the powerful will have to share with the less powerful. You see what I mean? And that sort of seems to go against the grain of human nature. That's why I'm raising these questions about democracy. It goes against the grain of human nature that somebody who's much more powerful will willingly share power with someone who's less powerful. So is democracy, should it be a self-regulating sort of mechanism, or does it need a constant set of regulations from inside of it to keep it healthy and constant, which is where the people come in. This thing you talked about earlier about accountability and holding people's feet to the fire.
You see, democracy comes with protective mechanisms. The first of which is a guarantee of human rights. And all those rights are listed in the Constitution. And the state has a responsibility to ensure all members of society enjoy those rights at all times. Then there's the rule of law, which ensures that the system of justice applies identically to every member of the community, the one that has all the power and the one that has no power. Now, when you start feeling that democracy is not working very well, is when you see that that rule of law is becoming problematic. Nigerians now know today that the judicial system is not giving the same justice to everybody. We saw, for example, the election tribunals, where the rules that apply to the ruling party do not apply to what are considered opposition parties. And there is choice in terms of what precedent is applied to who, depending on your party. Now, that's a complete contravention of the constitutional provisions we have of the rule of law in this country. Is the corruption of the judiciary by the political class that has produced that problem. The issue, therefore, is to now start looking at those conditions for the protection of democracy and see how we can ensure that we do not get them completely eroded, that it makes nonsense about the whole democratic process.
And to take that even further, because I think that there's some great nuggets within that assessment that you gave. I mean, a word that kind of beats throughout definitions of democracy is the word equality. And so an election such as Nigeria had in 2023 is supposed to be the moment at which the ritual of equality seems most truthful. We're all supposed to go with one vote, and the president and all the powerful politicians are seeing going in with the same one vote that we have. But we never see the result of that equality as a result of democracy. I mean, and I'm wondering whether that is a necessary, I mean, obviously equality is a necessary condition of it, but we never see it manifested, do we?
Yeah, because that's the corruption of the democratic system, when externalities are brought in to weaken that equality. Over the past decade, for example, we've seen politicians buying votes. Now, if a politician can buy the vote of somebody who is poor, then we have compromised the principle of one person, one vote.
So basically, it's the politicians who undermine that sense of equality.
Exactly, because they are able to now use public resources they have stolen to undermine the entire principles of equality. And that's why people get extremely dissatisfied with the outcomes of a lot of our elections, because they know if the playing field has been level, the outcome we get might not be the outcome that would have grown out of
well,
a system
we're almost
that
out of time here. I mean, it's always brilliant talking with you, but just very briefly, let's look at another signal theme of democracy, which you touched on briefly earlier, which is the duty of the citizen. What are the duties of Nigerian citizens with regard to democracy, briefly?
I think, you see, the big change in democracy was from Athenian democracy, which was a democracy in a slave society in which only 10% of the population practiced democracy and the rest are slaves. Then we moved to representative democracy, because once you move to the reality that everybody is a player, then not everybody can sit in the public square and take collective decisions. So we are 230 million, we can't all sit on the square. So you have this problem of representation, where those elected to represent us reflect our views and the instructions we give them. But rather than do that, they then see themselves as our bosses, disregard our desires and instructions, and do what they want to because they can by corrupting the system. It's therefore the necessity of correcting that system to make sure people don't have undue power and privilege because they have been elected into a position, but rather go back to the basics, which is the whole principle of equality and the rule of law.
I was saying at the outset, before you came in, that I couldn't think of anybody better to deal with this subject and deal with it as thoroughly as yourself. I want to thank you very much indeed. Professor Jibrin Ibrahim is a development expert, professor of political science, and chair of the editorial board of Nigeria's Premium Times newspaper, who's also a noted psephologist and senior fellow at the Center for Democracy and Development. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Charles.